A nation experiences its highest peak of peace and prosperity. Then, within exactly 50 years, its capital is reduced to smoldering ash, and the starving population is driven to the absolute brink of survival. Before this collapse, the Kingdom of Judah enjoyed a brief but spectacular golden age under King Josiah. Around 622 BC, workers repairing the national temple stumbled upon a forgotten copy of the Torah. This sparked a national spiritual renaissance, with Josiah systematically purging pagan altars and restoring a sense of order. But that peace shattered at the strategic mountain pass of Megiddo in 609 BC. The Egyptian army was marching north to intervene in a foreign conflict. Josiah rode out to intercept them, disguised himself for battle, and was mortally wounded by an Egyptian archer. The people placed his sons on the throne, but they were quickly deposed and replaced by puppet kings loyal to Egypt. Rulers like Jehoiakim heavily taxed an already impoverished population to build lavish palaces, nullifying Josiah's reforms and plunging Jerusalem back into judicial corruption and idol worship. The sudden loss of their righteous king removed the moral anchor of the nation. Without that spiritual identity holding them together, Judah fractured from the inside out, leaving them fatally exposed as global superpowers began to close in. Watching this internal decay was a man named Habakkuk. Unlike other prophets who were shepherds or farmers from the countryside, Habakkuk was a highly trained insider. As a Levite temple musician, he was part of the religious establishment, giving him a front-row seat as his society rotted. He looked around Jerusalem and saw the rich systematically exploiting the poor. And as he looked beyond his borders, he saw an entirely new threat emerging. The terrifying military machine of Babylon was marching west. This creates a theological crisis for Habakkuk. He asks, if God is perfectly good and powerful, why would he allow a ruthlessly wicked empire like Babylon to swallow up Judah, a nation that, despite its heavy flaws, is still less wicked than its conquerors? The text we have from him doesn't read like a standard sermon delivered to a crowd. Instead, it reads as an agonizing, intensely private dialogue, a man wrestling directly with the Creator over the problem of divine justice. In 605 BC at Carchemish, Babylon obliterates Egypt, becoming the region's master. Nebuchadnezzar marches on Jerusalem, extracting the finest royal youth, including Daniel, as hostages. Following a rebellion 3 years later, Babylon returns, looting the temple and deporting 10,000 elites, including Ezekiel. Nebuchadnezzar leaves behind a weak king named Zedekiah to rule over the poorest remaining citizens. Despite the frantic public warnings of the prophet Jeremiah to surrender, Zedekiah caves to nationalist pressure and forms a desperate military alliance with Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar responds to this final betrayal by marching his entire army to Jerusalem and locking the city in an unyielding 18-month siege. Trapped inside the walls, the population starves until they are driven to the absolute extremes of survival. In July 586 BC, Babylonians breach the gates. They capture Zedekiah, systematically set fire to Solomon's temple, and level Jerusalem's defensive walls. Judah's kings repeatedly placed their survival in the hands of shifting political alliances, trusting Egyptian military backing over their own established laws. That calculation cost them their entire homeland. To the outside world, this looked like the gods of Babylon had physically overpowered the God of Israel, but the biblical narrative offers a different perspective. Yahweh was using Babylon to discipline his own people. God and Israel's relationship was a covenant, a legally binding treaty. Obedience brought prosperity, abandonment meant expulsion. But Israel was in massive breach of contract, practicing syncretism with pagan idols, while the wealthy corrupted the justice system, systematically exploiting the poor. This created a severe judicial dilemma. If God is a perfectly just judge, he cannot ignore this level of evil. Providing continuous military protection while his people oppressed the vulnerable would mean actively condoning their crimes. He would be an accomplice. To maintain his moral character, God enforced the contract. He withdrew protection, handing them over to experience life under the cruel rules of pagan empires. The exile functioned as a mechanism for preservation rather than a sentence of execution. By removing Israel from the land, God was intervening in their downward spiral. The land of Canaan had become thoroughly infected with idolatry. By physically removing the people from that environment, God essentially placed them in quarantine. It was a severe intervention, designed to break centuries of spiritual addiction. In the crucible of Babylon, isolated from the agricultural idols of their homeland, the Israelites were forced to confront their broken identity. It was a painful, highly concentrated period of spiritual rehabilitation. Historically, we can see the exact outcome of this process. After 70 years in exile, a remnant of Israel returned to Jerusalem. From that point forward, they never struggled with the worship of physical idols again. The discipline worked, reframing the exile as a calculated act of parental salvation, proving that divine power was being exercised through the conquest, not defeated by it. This brings us back to Habakkuk. As he stands in his watchtower, looking out at the gathering storm clouds of the Babylonian army, he finally understands the brutal reality of what is about to happen to his home. He realizes the economy will collapse, the farms will burn, and invaders will breach the walls. Yet he concludes that he can still rejoice. His joy is no longer tied to his own physical safety or comfort, but is rooted deeply in the unchanging, just character of God. He writes down a phrase that becomes the enduring thesis of the book: "The just shall live by his faith." When current events look bleak, and the immediate evidence suggests God is silent, a righteous person must rely entirely on trust. This trauma reveals a specific hierarchy. God permitted the destruction of his own temple to prioritize the internal character of his people. The physical real estate was negotiable, their spiritual health was not. God valued the moral integrity of his people far more than the stone and cedar of his own house.